I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to Sleerickets, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. I am back in town, and I have a lot to talk about. First, though, I wanted to give you a couple of quick announcements. One, I just wanted to repeat my invitation to anybody who ever studied with Louise Glick, who wants to talk about it on or off the record. Write me at sleerickets@gmail.com. Two, send in your AMA questions. We're still figuring out a date when Cameron, Brian, Alice, and I can all talk, and we've got a handful of questions. We are bracing for Cameron's inevitable diabolical questions, and we would love to hear from more of you. So write us about anything and everything, personal, professional. Is there a profession to speak of? Or otherwise, at sleerickets@gmail.com. Third, quickly, a review just came out of Ethan McGuire, friend of the show, friend of many of the magazines that have ever been affiliated with the show. Ethan McGuire, author of Apocalypse Dance. There is a positive review, very, very positive review of his book Apocalypse Dance in Radix. So presumably it's not Radix Malorum. It's not the root of evil as the magazine. Anyway, it's a Christian magazine called Radix, and it's a review of his book. The endorsement is good. The review is fine. It's very responsible. I mean, at some point maybe I'll do an episode about like what might make for good or bad reviews, because it's very diligent. It's very studious. But it definitely never uses an Anglo-Saxon word where a Latin word will do, and it feels much more like there's a little bit of a kind of a critical perspective, but there's not much in the way of a recognizable voice. So it is mostly kind of combing through observations about the book. But congrats to Ethan's on the good review. Speaking of reviews, I'm working with Tim Green right now to put together a list of potential reviewers for the chapbook of mine that's coming out. It's called The Soft Black Stars. It's 15 new poems, new meaning not in my most recent book. I think actually I have once reviewed a chapbook, but I'm hard pressed to think of other instances in which anybody bothered to review a chapbook. Regardless, Tim wanted some suggestions for potential reviewers, and he will send a review copy. So if you are a reviewer, or you know a reviewer, or you have an idea, or you're an editor of a magazine that might be interested in considering reviewing it, then let me know. And I'll pass your address along to Tim. So send your address and who you are, to what magazine or whatever you are affiliated with, to sleerickets@gmail.com. And if you're a freelance spec reviewer, then send me, tell me that. If you'd like a preview of the book, one of the poems, and maybe the grossest of the poems, It's a little more of a sex poem than I typically get into, but the new Stylus, which is a little online Substack poetry magazine, just published 6 poems of mine. One of them, called Autofiction, is a comparatively graphic sex poem that is in the Soft Black Stars, and it is Not all of the poems are like that, but I would say it's fairly representative of the. If you are a Christian, or you are a lover of Greek myths, or you are a lover of dramatic monologues, the explicitly Browning-esque dramatic monologues, I think you will probably hate this chapbook. But if you like short, sharp lyrics on sex, marriage, and depression, then you might like it. I tried to make it good. If nothing else, I tried to make it good. You can check out one of the poems, Autofiction, at New Stylus. They publish a bunch of poems all in a row that have nothing to do with one another, including the last one is the poem, my assassination poem that I said on the Secret Show I thought nobody would ever publish. I got some help from Jonathan with the title. So that is at the New Stylus. I'll put a link in the show notes. It's 6 new poems, all pretty short, except for the autofiction, which is like a page or so. And they have like a lively New Stylus crowd that likes to comment on the poems. I haven't read the comments, but there are a few of them all right. I went to Chicago as threatened, but I did not meet up with any listeners or even go to a solo adult movie, though I did have one picked out. Instead, after I arrived, I did something much more grown up. I felt ill and took a nap. I did later that night, by serendipity, stumble in a ratty undershirt down to the lobby, queasy and lightheaded, to wait for a pizza to arrive, and ran into the entire wedding party of Elijah and Laura's wedding. They had just done the rehearsal dinner, and so I met everybody in not my best form. It was a fascinating visit, kind of a whirlwind, but I got only a little bit of a sense of Chicago. Mostly I saw Evanston, which is sort of the college town portion that surrounds Northwestern. I did, at Anne Blumoff's insistence, go see Lake Michigan, which was frigidly beautiful and just insanely big. I met Elijah's best friend, David, who was very funny and charming. The first thing he said to me as I shook his hand was, "Wow, you don't look anything like I thought you would based on your podcast." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" And Elijah jumped in to reassure me by saying, "Oh, no, don't worry. He just means that your voice sounds very manly and impressive." So that was good. It was a good start. Good start to the visit. Well, it wasn't actually the absolute start. I did get a long lift ride. It was like a 45-minute ride back and forth from the airport. Just an odd observation. So on the way in, I listened to I didn't listen. The driver was playing an oldies station. On the way back, the driver was playing a different driver was playing a top 40 station. During those two, between those two trips, I heard at least 4 Max Martin songs. The guy who wrote all the songs on And Juliet, and really just apparently has defined American pop music for 30 years now. But what kind of blew my mind was listening to the oldies, and on the way into town, oldies, of course, at this point just meant like songs that were coming out when I was a kid. And so I remember when these songs were first on the radio, and my experience was twofold. One was that I was surprised to hear all these songs being played on the same station, because when they came out back in the 90s, all of these songs would have been coming out on different radio stations. Like, in order to hear all of the songs that I heard during that 45-minute ride, you would have had to tune into like 3, maybe 4 different radio stations to get to the different genres and subtypes of music that they represented. But of course, now they're just all oldies. And that was the other part of the experience, was that, A, like Max Martin wrote half of them apparently, but B, the primary impression I had listening to them was like, oh, these just sound like that period. Like, these just sound like the 90s. That's mostly what they sound like, even though at the time, they all seemed like they were spanning the whole spectrum of what, popular music might be. Now they just all sound like 90s music. It did put me in mind of a thing that comes up in my fiction classes where, I'll bring in short stories, and we'll read a handful of short stories as we go through, talking about their work as well. And my experience is that I try to bring in stories that represent like a variety of styles and forms and perspectives, and there's across gender and race and nationality and class and all sorts of questions. And my students, generally speaking, I find are really good at reading across all sorts of boundaries. They're reading against the grain of their own experience. They tend to be great about that, and reading against the grain of their own taste often. Not always, but they tend to be pretty good about a more experimental or more sci-fi-ish kind of a take on fiction. The one factor that really consistently that is the biggest. It is the biggest obstacle to their enjoyment or comprehension. It's not to say that none of them ever enjoy or comprehend these stories, but that the most consistent obstacle to their enjoyment or comprehension across all of these other dimensions is time. That is, the more time has passed since a story was published, the harder a time the students tend to have understanding it or enjoying it. What, like in that case, I don't spend a lot of time trying to convince them to enjoy things they don't enjoy, but I do, like, they will sometimes observe. I taught a Stephen King story, and I had a student say, like, well, he just always sounds so corny, and like he's sounding like he's in the 70s, or he's sounding like he's in the 80s. It sounds like this sort of fake folksy voice that represents this time that just feels like it's so dated. And I agree with, like, I think that is true of a lot of his work. And you do hear a voice that it's not totally convincing today. But what I try to make them aware of and make myself, keep myself aware of, is that this is also true of our writing. That inevitably what we are writing will to some extent feel dated. And so it's always sort of an interesting question to ask, like, well, what are the things that we're not aware are the background radiation of our time? And it makes me really wonder about contemporary poetry, because we today in the poetry world think about poems as, different poems coming out as being wildly different from one another in style, in approach, in philosophy, in form, etc. But what's likely is that, maybe not 20, 30 years, but like 50 years, definitely 100 years, the poems being written today will, for the most part, just sound like this period. Like free verse, formal, flarific, not flarific anymore, but like whatever, experimental, confessional, surreal, didactic, whatever, prose poems, they will mostly just sound like now, like to the people living then. And so I'm really curious, like, what are the qualities of our moment? What are the soon to be dated aspects of poetry today that cross those different genre boundaries? And I don't know, but I'm really curious. Yeah, I'm like eager to kind of think about it. Mostly though, I did want to just say that, like, it was a really, really lovely visit. I met a ton of Elijah's people, obviously. I had met Laura, his now wife, once before. She was delightful. I met David's girlfriend, Sammy, who was really smart and funny, and is in a professional context, an environmental activist. And I recommended to her Brian's book, The Optimists, because she said she's interested in environmental. She obviously, like, her professional life is all environmental activity, but she tends to find books about it boring because they're really preachy and didactic. And I told her she just likes, like, juicy stories. And so I told her that this was a really juicy novel that also dealt with, like, animal rights activism and, like, animal rights terrorism or sabotage. But I had a lot of fun talking to her. Met Ahmed, Elijah's brother, and Bennett, Vivian, his sister, and Seamus, their significant others. Saw the lovely Anne, again, Elijah's mom, and met his dad, who wore a cowboy hat and fought through a cold, but was really impressive. And like seeing all of them, there's so much resemblance across, but they are very different, all of them. And as I told Anne, I was sort of surprised by how, I recognized a lot of Elijah in his family, but I was also surprised by how much is just original to Elijah. Saw Ethan and Autumn, his wife, whom I had met briefly once before. She was a lot of fun to talk to. And Tim, who I think I'd said hi to in Cleveland, but spent a little more time talking with a long time, as he described himself, a Versecraft groupie, who's also a Sleeve Ricketts listener. The wedding, my initial impression of the wedding was it was way too small for me to be there. Like, it was a really lovely, intimate affair, and, like, I had no business being at a wedding that size. Like, I should be way further down the list, but I was really honored to be there. It was extremely Elijah from start to finish. It took place in the Time and Glass Museum, which is real. And it was, very traditionally Jewish, but also very kind of poetry heavy and like beautifully. Like I have never before appreciated the aesthetic theme of a wedding, but it was like really unified and really well executed. And like they even gave out like beautiful, thematically consistent kipputs for the men to cover their heads. Kippah. I thought with Hebrew you do pronounce the T, unlike in French. Kippah. Yarmulke is what I would have called it. It was all very green, very viney. Even Elijah's wedding ring, which David made, was beautiful. It had I think it was laurel leaves on it, and a little hamsa, sneaking in a little Eastern iconography there. The majority of the ceremony was sung, not just sung, belted out by Elijah's dad in Hebrew, most of it, and it was filled with elements that I would normally recoil from. I mean, to be honest, it was the singing, the heavy reliance on foreign language that I'm not remotely conversant in, multiple original poems read. The bride and groom wrote their own vows, and they were, like multiple pages long, each of them. But the truth is, like, it was all really beautiful and touching. The highlight for me was Laura's vows that she wrote, which were really plain spoken and honest, and I don't get moved by weddings. My refrain has been the wedding is for your family, the marriage is for you, but it was all quite lovely and touching. I was also really struck by how valuable the ritual seemed. I mean, there's a lot of like very specific Jewish ritual. You have to, walk around this many times and raise this hand and do this thing. And there was a formal signing of a marriage contract, and there are all these sort of gestures and rituals and ceremonies and, repetitions. Both, like the dad sang, the mom sang, and sang, Elijah sang a little bit. Yeah, there was a lot. There was a lot involved. It was stomping of the glass, the hora, which is the hoisting the chairs while they play Hava Nagila. I have one quick criticism, not of this wedding, but of traditional Judaism, which is just this. Apparently, the rule is, for the hora, both the bride and the groom are hoisted up on chairs, and they're not just lifted up. They're lifted up to like shoulder height and then vigorously lifted up and down and up and down and up and down over and over and over again throughout the length of the song. And the rule is the men lift the man and the women lift the woman. So like all of the guys went and lifted up Elijah's chair, and then Laura's chair, like all the women had to lift Laura's chair, and it worked fine. They did fine. But it just seemed to me like, come on, traditional Judaism, what are you doing? Like, there's so few things that men, like, there's so few areas where men can say definitively, unquestionably, we're a little better at this one. Like, lifting things over our heads is one of them. Come on now. Why egalitarianism here? It would be like if like the groom had to open his ceremonial wedding pickle jar and the bride had to open her own. I just thought that was bad traditional Jewish planning. Ancient rabbis of old, or whoever came up with the hora, probably not that old. Hava Nagila doesn't sound like a very old song. It's Yiddish, I guess. So Russian, I don't know. But yeah, it was lovely ceremony. Really and like fun. Thoughts of, like, it was both traditional and like comfortably contemporary, and there was pop music and silly jokes and things. And Elijah's dad was like the perfect degree of self-deprecatingly corny that you would want from a rabbi. Just a lovely man who was also, like, despite again struggling with a cold, was a really impressive singer. Like it takes, if you're going to belt out ancient Hebrew songs throughout the entirety of a wedding ceremony, you have to be really confident in your ability. And he was, and rightly so. He was really good at it, despite the occasional cough. But I had this thought, which was like an old argument between Protestants and Catholics, not even involving Jews at all, is this question about ritual. And like one of the refrains of a lot of the Protestant Reformation was, hey, God doesn't need all of these beads and statues and incense and priests. God doesn't need all of this paraphernalia, all of these trappings in order to communicate with man. God can communicate with man directly. Look what he did with Abraham. And so there was this idea among a lot of, not all Protestants are the same, but there's an idea among, a lot of the Protestants that you don't need this stuff. And I think the Catholic response, which has always seemed pretty true to me, but it felt especially true watching this ceremony, is that, yeah, of course God doesn't need this stuff. Of course, like, God doesn't exist. But like, even assuming God exists, like, why would God need there to be a priest, or need there to be beads, or need there to be statues or incense or bells or any of this stuff? Why would God need any of this stuff at all? Obviously he wouldn't, but it's not for him. It's for us, because human beings need these things. And that's what, I felt that watching the ceremony, that we do need rituals of some kind. We do need some sort of, here is the thing you say that then shows that this has now happened. Here is the gesture you make that demonstrates your placing this other person's interests above your own. And it charges the experience with a sense of felt reality. It's not just an abstract light switch that's flipped. Well, now we're married. You feel like a thing is being fashioned through this ceremony. And I found that really touching. I talked to Ethan a little bit about it, and he pointed out that at least in some interpretations of the Jewish tradition, the argument is made that the Jews, the ancient Hebrews, made a compact with God, but the compact was not, the covenant wasn't about belief. That wasn't really part of it. The covenant was about practice. Do and don't eat these foods. Do and don't cut skin off your penis in this way. Like, you do the things, and then you are a Jew. And that felt right, because I know there's a lot more ambivalence, and there's a lot less fussiness, I find, among the Jews I know when it comes to the specific question of faith. Even though, like, even the outright atheists I know who are Jewish still consider themselves Jewish, and still in many cases participate in portions of the tradition. And that seemed that was my experience watching this ceremony, was that definitely a lot of these people do believe in God. I have no interest in making questioning or commenting on that, but to perform all of these gestures, to participate in this ceremony in this way. And by gesture, I don't mean that dismissively. Like, to do all of the official things, to satisfy the rituals. It's not really necessary to believe in God. But it is necessary. The thought I had during the ceremony was, what is necessary is that there's a belief in a people, right? Whether or not everybody there believed in God, they believed in the Jewish people. And the thought I had was, like, that's quite beautiful. And it's, there are different versions of this. Like even as an absolute outsider, I have some of this feeling of kind of being touched and having admiration when I encounter certain aspects of, like, Black American culture, where there's a belief in in like the Black American experience, that this is like, this is a people, this is a tradition, and there's something that's important about that. There's something worth preserving and recognizing about that. And then the other thought I had was that sentiment that you have a devotion to or loyalty to a people. And that was apparent because this is a wedding where like you have both, there was both like the rule was you had to have two witnesses who are not related, who are Jewish, but are not related to the bride and groom, who have to be present. And there were a lot of people who were Jewish. And there were a lot of people who weren't related to the bride and groom. But it turned out they only managed to get, I think, the two who were Jewish in the sort of technical ethnic sense, meaning their mothers were Jewish. So if your father's Jewish and your mother's not, then there is at least one sense in which you're sort of not considered Jewish. Now, what's also true is that both Anne, Elijah's mom, and Laura, his now wife, converted to Judaism. They are Jews now, like they're real Jews now, but they converted. So there was sort of both a kind of an honoring of a blood lineage, as well as a recognition that there's some flexibility. This was, by the way, like I was reminded of every mass I went to growing up, where like the priest would be sneezing and coughing and wiping his nose on his sleeve, and then take a big old sip from the communion wine cup and then pass it around. Then give it to the congregants, because what are germs in the face of God's, the transubstantiation of God's body. So I really appreciated that Elijah's dad, who had a cough, made a point of not doing that. There was a communal cup that you could participate partake in if you wanted to, and he made a point of not drinking from it because he was sick, and it felt like a Jewish pragmatism, where like there are things I admire about the Catholic tradition, the things are, it's definitely deeply a part of me, but like pragmatism, not always the greatest Catholic virtue. The other thought I had though about this question of believing in a people was that it's touching and inspiring up until the point when that people that you have this belief in and that your rituals preserve, up until the point where that people stops being an underdog, right? Which is like the reason I think some people make a point of saying like, well, there is like a Black American culture, but it's not really true to say there's a white American culture. And I think like Ta-Nehisi Coates has smartly pointed out that like what there is there's Christian, there's like there's lots of other slices, some of which cover race and some of which don't. But like you could argue there's an Italian American people, there's an Italian American culture tradition, there's an Irish American culture tradition, there's a big German American tradition that people mostly don't acknowledge. There are all sorts of specific traditions, ethnicities, religions, etc. But like white overall is defined by negation for the most part. It's also the overdog, or at least has been for a long time, and is at the moment, and for a little while longer. And when an overdog people treats their own peopleness in a precious way, it's a lot less touching and moving. Which was like the thought I had, was like, this is really moving and this is really lovely. And like, these are not just like generic American Jews. Like the Elijah's family, most of them live in Texas. And as his brother said, they, if you're a prominent rabbi in Texas, they get death threats. People have come to the house to menace them. So there's a real threat. There is real threat of this long tradition of, anti-Semitism and of, explicit violence against Jews. So in that context, a heartfelt commitment to the recognition of and preservation of the Jewish people is really touching. The thought in the back of my mind was Israel. Not to say that not to say Israel should or shouldn't exist, but like I wonder if this reads differently in a place where you're no longer the underdog. But yeah, this is not an episode about Israel, so I'm not going to try to dig into that too deeply. I did have a really good conversation with Anne, who wrote an original poem, which, as I told her, didn't strike me as amateurish at all when I heard it. And she laughed in a way that let me know that that was not the compliment I intended it to be. But I talked with her about the difficulty of writing a wedding poem, which it is. It's really hard to write a wedding poem. And the reason it's hard to write a wedding poem is that, I think the example she gave was like, you couldn't really like slip into the couplet of a sonnet that like, oh, and I'm not sure if the person you've always believed to be your father is actually your biological father. Like you couldn't slip in that kind of revelation into a poem to be read at a wedding because it would be jarring and upsetting and disturbing. But like, that's exactly the kind of thing you would slip into a poem that is meant to provoke an emotional reaction from a stranger, which is what lyric poems are meant to do. The problem with weddings is that you're writing for a ritual in which nobody really wants to be challenged or made uncomfortable. I told her, like my dad and his wife asked me to write a poem for their wedding, and I did. It's not my favorite poem that I've written. I think it had some strengths. I was satisfied with it as a an occasional poem. But there was a problem, which was that in order to try to make it touching, it had a volta, meaning for the first 8 lines, people were really unhappy. And then it turned, and it was an endorsement of the wedding and the coupling, and it was, I thought it ended in a nice way. But in order to end in a nice way and have that mean anything, have that feel like anything, it has to begin in a way that's not so nice. This is the way poems work, and this is, as she pointed out, what's so hard about writing a wedding poem, especially on demand for a specific occasion. I was reminded by all of the beautiful readings and speeches and poems and impromptu testimonies and tributes at the wedding. There was an open invitation at the end for toasts, and I gave a toast, and my triumph was I kept it to 2 sentences. And that was it. 2 sentences, get a laugh, and shut up. That's the rule with wedding toasts. Or at least if you're not the best man or if you're not a member of the wedding party. But I was a little bit envious during this, wedding of the kind of the richness of sources and citations. And, Elijah talked about Horace, and his dad talked about Baucis and Philemon, the couple that they hosted Zeus and Hermes in disguise, and for their hospitality, they were an elderly couple. They were rewarded by being transformed into 2 trees, a linden and an oak, I think, and their branches are intertwined. But our wedding was, my wife is Joanna is a sort of a straight ahead Southern Presbyterian, not Southern Presbyterian, and I think there was a little bit of a split where the part of the church that didn't want to honor gay weddings broke off in one direction. But so it's not, I think it was not having to do with that split, but she was in the South and they were Presbyterian. So our wedding was at a Presbyterian church. It was a very Presbyterian wedding. I remember the invitation that I can't remember if they call him a priest or a minister, their head guy. The invitation he made was, you can choose any readings you would like for the ceremony, as long as they're all from the Bible. So we had some, I think we went with like the typical 1 Corinthians 13 and some other stuff, but I did slip one little bit of paganism into the wedding, and I did it I figured that there is at least in any English translation I know of, there is a lot of poetry in the Bible, but there's not any rhyming poetry, or at least any poetry that rhymes in English that I have seen a rendering of. Maybe I've missed part, but the King James at least, I don't recall rhyming poems in there. Maybe I'm forgetting something obvious. But I figured that for most people, old-timey language or inverted syntax, references to confusing names, unfamiliar names, and rhyme specifically would all trigger in the minds of people sort of like zoning out during a wedding. They would all trigger associations with old-timey official speech and maybe a kind of a generally conservative outlook. And so I figured I could slip in a little rhyming translation of Sappho and nobody would notice that it was not from the Bible. I don't know if they did, but they managed to, they let us include it. It was my brother-in-law read Housman's little translation of a fragment from Sappho. So it's sometimes published separately. This is just this little, is it 6 lines? No, it's 8 lines in rhyming couplets, and it is, I think that the Sappho fragment is substantially shorter, I believe, but it is an epithalamium. So epithalamia are, if I recall, there are a couple different versions. There's there's a hymeneia something, which is for a poem for the procession, like poem song to be performed during the procession of the bride, and then there's a prothalamium. Which I don't know if that's that may be a neologism. I think it's Spencer who kind of wrote the one that's primarily known in English, but there's sort of different poems for different parts of the wedding. And an epithalamium specifically, if I think it was Aaron Pashigian who told me about this. My recollection is that is the song that is meant to be sung by the friends of the bride and groom while the bride and groom are having sex for the first time. So they're in a little spot having sex, and then on either side of the little tucked away, I don't know, tent, cabin, building, on either side, the wedding party are chanting or singing lines from this poem back and forth to each other. And I think like partly the idea is to drown out all the sounds of fucking, but also maybe partly the idea is to tease or intimidate the bride and groom. I don't know. But those are like those, Sappho has a few of those, and those are often the ones where she kind of makes a point of saying how big and manly the groom is. I mean, how beautiful the bride is. So I guess they're also, they're a little bit meant to be aphrodisiac. I guess it's like playing Marvin Gaye outside of your nuptial fucking chamber. So this is a little fragment of an epithalamium that Sappho wrote, translated by A. Housman. It goes, happy bridegroom Hesper brings all desired and timely things. All whom morning sends to Rome, Hesper loves to lead them home. Home return who him behold, child to mother, sheep to fold, bird to nest from wandering wide. Happy bridegroom, seek your bride. So Hesper is Hesperus, the evening star. So like it's nighttime now, time for marital sex, time to go make it official. And there's this nice parallel which is very, very old. I mean, I think of like the beginning of the Canterbury Tales as the first time I encountered this trope, but it is not invented by Chaucer. Juan that April with his sota, the drog the march hath pierced to the rota, and bathed every vein in sweet liquor, of which virtue engendered is the fleur. Juan Zephyrus eke with his sweater breath, in spirit hath, in every holt and heath, the tender croppies and the young zona, hath in ram his halve corsi rona. And smale foolies maken melodia, that schleppen al de nicht with open ear, so pricketh hem naturen hier courages, than longen folk to go on pilgrimages. So, a lot of Middle English there. Hey, it's spring nature is coming into its own in spring. Things are getting fertilized. There's pollen in the air. There's dew. There's botanical semen everywhere. This is what humans do too. Like the nature's fertility is depicted in terms of human attraction. So even a line like, so pricketh him naturen hier courages. nature pricks them in their hearts, with all of the implications that would have in with contemporary use of the word prick. But this is a very, very old trope that like nature's fertility is, likened to human fertility. If my theater history class was correct, then during the rural Dionysia, which is during the dark time of the year, around the time of the winter solstice, there's a big celebration out in the countryside, the rural Dionysia, to cheer back on the coming of the spring and the light, right? Dionysus dies and is resurrected in the spring. Persephone comes back, Earth gets fertilized. And the story I remember hearing was that one of the things they did during the rural Dionysia was they would march around carrying giant phalluses, like literally sort of like, it's like a symbolic magic to encourage the earth to get fucked again and get filled up with fertility and be ready to give birth. So there's this lovely parallel imagery of the bridegroom seeking out the bride, coming back, going to what is now home to be with the bride, and all of the other things that are supposed to go home at nightfall are doing the same: child to mother, sheep to fold, bird to nest from wandering wide. Because Hesper, the evening star at evening time, nightfall, is calling them home. So that stanza, those 8 lines, were then ended up being the middle of a longer poem that Housman wrote that he called Epithalamium. Sappho's poems are all fragments. I think maybe there's one or two that are complete. I think one of the newer ones that were discovered is supposed to be complete. But pretty much all of the Sappho we have they're fragments. And in some cases, it's just a tiny shard of a poem, a couple words. In others, it's almost all of a poem, or what seems to be almost all of a poem. So different scholars and poets have over the centuries made various attempts to fill in those gaps. Housman writes a longer poem in which that stanza sits, I think, very comfortably. But his longer poem is substantially more ambivalent, or to take a word of Sappho's, bittersweet, than that smaller fragment might suggest. So I thought I would read through it and just say a word or two, because I think it's quite a beautiful poem, and there's some maybe interesting little wrinkles to it. So there are a handful of proper nouns that come up right at the beginning. Urania is one of the muses. She's the muse of astronomy. She is, I want to say she's the one Milton claims dictated Paradise Lost to him. So Urania is the muse of astronomy. Hymen is the god of weddings. I think there are a handful of different gods of marriages and weddings, but Hymen's a specific god of wedding ceremonies. And he is the son of one of the muses, and which one, apparently the answer varies depending on the source. Helicon is a mountain, is the mountain of the muses. It is sometimes depicted as the birthplace of the muses or the home of the muses. Other times it just is a place where the Hippocrene flows, the stream and river, and that's sacred to them. So they are, it's either the home of the muses or just a really good place to run into them. Oeta is the name of a mountain in Greece. The Indies are the Indies, and India, the east. Hesper is Hesperus, the evening star. I think that's most of it. But don't worry too much about the proper nouns. It's from Last Poems, which, funnily enough, was not Housman's last book, although it was the last book he published after he died. I think his brother put together another collection. This is Epithalamium by A.E. Housman. He is here, Urania's son, Hymen come from Helicon, God that glads the lover's heart. He is here to join and part. So the groomsman quits your side, and the bridegroom seeks the bride. Friend and comrade yield you o'er to her that hardly loves you more. All right, I will try not to annoy Cameron by interrupting any more than this, but This introduces the essential tension of the poem. The god that glads the lover's heart. Hymen is here to help make sure the wedding goes smoothly, but he's here not just to join the bride and the groom, but to part the groom from his friends. And specifically this one friend, the groomsman, which is singular, not plural. So the groomsman quits your side. Friend and comrade, yield you o'er to her that hardly loves you more. It's an interesting little misgiving there. It's hardly as if the bride loves you more than your friends. Maybe just a little, maybe. So that's how the poem begins, and I'll continue through. I won't interrupt it again on this reading. He is here, Urania's son, Hymen come from Helicon, god that glads the lover's heart. He is here to join and part. So the groomsman quits your side, and the bridegroom seeks the bride. Friend and comrade, yield you o'er to her that hardly loves you more. Now the sun his skyward beam has tilted from the ocean stream. Light the Indies, laggard sun. Happy bridegroom, day is done, and the star from Oeta's steep calls to bed, but not to sleep. Happy bridegroom, Hesper brings all desired and timely things. All whom morning sends to roam, Hesper loves to lead them home. Home return who him behold, child to mother, sheep to fold, bird to nest from wandering wide. Happy bridegroom, seek your bride. Pour it out, the golden cup, given and guarded, brimming up, safe through jostling markets borne, and the thicket of the thorn, folly spurned and danger past, pour it to the god at last. Now to smother noise and light is stolen abroad the wildering night, and the blotting shades confuse path and meadow full of dews, and the high heavens that all control turn in silence round the pole, catch the starry beams they shed, prospering the marriage bed, and breed the land that reared your prime sons to stay the rot of time. All is quiet, no alarms, nothing fear of nightly harms. Safe you sleep on guarded ground, and in silent circle round the thoughts of friends keep watch and ward, harnessed angels, hand on sword. Sorry if I started to slip into poetry voice there. I just love this poem. I find it very beautiful. I'm also wondering if I was hearing, I was thinking it was Puck's speech, but it's just that it's in the same meter and rhyme scheme. It's actually Oberon's speech. So, yeah, at the end of Midsummer Night's Dream, there's a double wedding. It's double wedding and then sort of a reconciliation between Oberon and Titania. And Oberon gives a blessing to all of the brides and the grooms who are going off to their nuptial fuck chambers. And I wonder if Housman had this in his mind, this passage, because it's in the same tetrameter couplet, rhyming couplets in tetrameter with in most cases, a headless line, right? Like, so instead of da 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 da, you just get da 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 da, the meter from Auden's Lullaby, but also the meter from this speech and A Midsummer Night's Dream. Not just this speech, but this is the one that comes to mind. Now until the break of day, through this house each fairy stray, to the best bride bed will we, which by us shall blessed be, and the issue there create ever shall be fortunate. So shall all the couples three ever true in loving be, and the blots of nature's hand shall not in their issue stand, never mole, hair lip, nor scar, nor mark prodigious such as are despised in nativity shall upon their children be. With this field dew consecrate every fairy take his gate, and each several chamber bless through this palace with sweet peace, and the owner of it blessed ever shall in safety rest, trip away, make no stay, meet me all by break of day. To which Robin responds after everybody else leaves, if we shadows have offended, think but this, and all is mended, that you have but slumbered here while these visions did appear. He goes on to close the play out. But I wonder if that speech was in that now until the break of day, that speech was in Housman's mind when he wrote, now to smother noise and light is stolen abroad the wildering night, and the blotting shades confuse path and meadow full of dews, and the high heavens that all control turn in silence round the pole. Catch the starry beams they shed, prospering the marriage bed, and breed the land that reared your prime, sons to stay the rot of time. All is quiet, no alarms, nothing fear of nightly harms. Yeah, I wonder if that was in his mind. Even that, like, the blotting shades confuse, path and meadow full of dews, that sounds like it could be straight out of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Just a couple other things I thought I'd point out in this poem. It includes, and I want to say this is an image that is not original to Housman, that comes from, probably a dozen other places, much, much, much older. But I think this might be this is either the first place I encountered it, or it just like struck such a nerve of recognition that it felt like something that I'd always known to be true. Maybe it's like an old expression or something, but it is this metaphor for, I want to say it's a metaphor for virginity. I don't think it's just virginity. I think there's other things happening, the friendship and the youth and, purity and virtue and all these other things. But like specifically, there is this sort of wonderful metaphor for virginity, which, granted, cultures that prioritize virginity tend not to be great for women. However, sometimes they're good for poetry. And just as taken in the conventional old-timey sense that virginity is something that belongs to girls, maidens, and they must protect it until they preserve it until their wedding night. Like this ideal, and it's a dangerous world out there. And they're both like, they're predators, they're also tricksters, they're seducers, there are all sorts of things that might happen, and you've got to kind of guard your virginity as often as the way that this was framed. Again, not good culturally, but just imagistically, this image of a cup filled to the brim that you then have to carry through a crowded marketplace without spilling a drop. Just think, like, it's such a rich metaphor for that. And again, I think there are other things suggested there, but that little stanza, pour it out the golden cup, given and guarded, brimming up, safe through jostling markets borne, and the thicket of the thorn, folly spurned and danger past, pour it to the god at last. And that folly spurned and danger past, right? Like, you have to avoid your own foolishness, and you have to avoid danger as well if you want to preserve your virginity. Again, not a moral endorsement, but just a wonderful, wonderfully responsive image. And there's that bittersweetness, that ambivalence again, because even though this is, the whole point of a culture that preserves female virginity is the safeguarding of the marriage bed, right? The safeguarding of paternity inside of marriages. So having sex on your wedding night is so much the correct thing to do. But for Housman, there's a little sense of loss. We're pour it out. This thing that's been so preciously guarded, pour it out, give it up to the god. And this double-edgedness even sort of retroactively touches that stanza from Sappho. Happy bridegroom, Hesper brings that. Happy bridegroom is repeated because it doesn't go without saying in this case, because the bridegroom is happy, but maybe not everybody else is. Hesper brings all desired and timely things, right? It's not just that, you've long desired something and now is the right time for it. But it's also a distinction between some things that are desired are happening now, and some things that are happening are just happening because this is the time for them to happen, whether or not they're desired, which, for the groomsmen, they may not be. Not to too heavily incorporate Housman's own biography. Of course, Housman was gay and was in love with his best friend, Mose Jackson, or at least his long time, his college roommate, and his the guy who got him a job and lived with him for some years after he fucked up and flunked out of Cambridge. They lived together, and Housman finally declared himself, and things went bad. Mose was not happy, and Housman moved out, and a couple of years later, Moses fled the country. I'd read this poem many, many times. I had thought of it as one of the many specific inspirations for the wonderful A. Stallings translation of Housman's Latin inscription. The title she gives it in English is "To My Comrade Moses J. Jackson, Scoffer at This Scholarship." So I had read this one many times and admired it, but I had never until today bothered to try to check the geography. And I noticed something odd. He refers to a couple things that give us a little bit of a sense of where he is, or where the speaker of the poem is. The simplest is, he says, "And the star from Oeta's steep calls to bed but not to sleep. What star? Happy bridegroom Hesper brings all desired and timely things." So the evening star, Hesperus, is the star that he sees above Oeta's steep. Right? He's looking up. Oeta is the mountain. He sees above Oeta a star in the sky, and he says, there's Hesperus. So what does that tell you? It tells you he's looking west, and he sees the star in the sky. That means he's east of Oeta. Now, Eden actually does come back, right, east of Eden, because the image there, although it's anachronistic for Sappho, the thoughts of friends keep watch and ward, harnessed angels hands on sword. We can't help as moderns but hear the image of the covering cherub, I think is what Bloom calls it, the angel that guards Eden from Adam and Eve. So it's both the beginning of something and the end of something, the loss of a certain kind of innocence. But the speaker, based on where he's looking to see the evening star, is east of Oeta. An obvious candidate for a place in Greece that is east of Oeta is Lesbos, the Isle of Lesbos, where Sappho is from. This never failed to delight my high school students when I informed them that Sappho was from the Isle of Lesbos, or as they pronounced it, Lesbos. But Lesbos is east of Oeta, so if you're looking to the west, you might see above Oeta the western sky, the evening star. Right, there's Hesperus. The only trouble then is that just before the evening star appears, he says, "Now the sun his skyward beam has tilted from the ocean stream. Light the Indies, laggard sun. Happy bridegroom, day is done." So we're watching the sun. The sun's going down. And he's saying, "Light the Indies, laggard sun." You're taking too long, right? This is sort of like the inverse of an obad. If an obad is a protestation against the rising of the sun, this is sort of like an insistence that the sun go down. Again, because in both cases, nighttime is the time for fucking. This whole idea of an obad is, you don't need to leave my bed yet. In fact, this is just as Romeo and Juliet have a sonnet that they when they meet each other, they speak a sonnet to each other in dialogue. The scene where he wakes up in her room and she tells him that the light through the window is just a comet and it's not the sunrise yet and he can stay. That scene is itself an obad, acted out between two speakers. But this is kind of the opposite of that, saying, all right, the sun's taken a long time going down. It's nighttime now, and you're ready. You're happy, right? You, the happy bridegroom, you're ready for it to be night. Day is done. Light the Indies, laggard sun. The suggestion there is that the sun is going to light the Indies. My question, when I looked at this more closely, was, well, the Indies, India, that region of the world from Greece, from Lesbos, is to the east. But the sun sets to the west. So he's looking to the west, looking to the sun go down, and he's saying, light the Indies, laggard sun. But that's the wrong direction, right? The sun sets in the west, not the east. The Indies are to the east, not the west. I sent a long, complicated note to Chris Childers asking about this, and he said, don't worry about it. Basically, he very, very kindly wrote a note back while he was getting, he as he said, he was surprised that he managed to get ready before his delightful wife Sanaz. They were going to a concert, but he, while he was waiting for her, he typed out this note, which I'll share because it's, as one could only expect, it is incredibly learned. I wouldn't take the Oeta reference very literally as providing geographical information about the speaker's location. It's a reference to a bit early in one of Catullus's Epithalamia, 61 or 62. It's in my book. Again, look back at my book. The answer is there, and it is. If you have not, you should definitely buy and read the Penguin book of Greek and Latin lyric poetry. Chris's amazing 1,000-page anthology. He says, presumably the sun is thought of as shining in the east when it is dark in the west, meaning that, basically Greece is the west, the Indies are the east. The Indies are not so much to the east or to the west as they are just the other place where the sun goes when it's not here. So I'm overthinking it. I don't need to worry so much about it. He says there's a parallel idea found in Homer, I think, and elsewhere, that when it's dark on the upper world, it's shining in Tartarus for the sons of Ophion, who I think are giants, ? God knows Chris has a better idea than I do. I figure if it's dark here in the west, it's probably shining in the Indies, which just means the east. But he says, that's off the top of his head. He's not looking. This is just all from memory, because that's Chris Childers, the invaluable, the brilliant, and the ever generous. Here is the thought I had for what it's worth, which I think, given Chris's learnedness, you could probably disregard, but I got kind of excited thinking about it. So my thought was basically forget Oeta, forget Lesbos. The Indies from Greece are in the east. The sun goes down in the west. Maybe it's just the sun's up here, the sun's down there, it's not up here, vice versa. The other thought that came to mind is that in the poem he wrote some 20 years before this one, which is the one in Latin, To My Comrade Moses J. Jackson Scoffer, the scholarship, which Stallings translated. I did a whole episode talking with Alice about this poem and its context, which is I think quite moving. The thought I had was this: that maybe none of this matters. Maybe the Indies are just the other place. But given that we're not just talking about the Indies, we're also specifically looking to the West. Here's the thought I had. When he wrote that poem in 1903, Jackson was living in India. When he was putting together last poems, which he was doing as Jackson was dying, and he was doing it specifically because he wanted to have them together to show Jackson before he died. This was 1922 was when last poems came out. Jackson died in 1923. So at this time, he's written about Jackson being in the East, in the Orient, in the Indies, but he's not in the Indies anymore. He's in Canada, which is where he died. And so when he says, light the Indies, laggard sun, my thought was that there's this funny little collision, little intersection, little bundle. And the Indies he's talking about there are the West Indies. Obviously another anachronism from Sappho's perspective, but my thought was this might have been the dark matter that kind of straightens out the cattywampus geography of the poem. Certainly, regardless of whether there's any geography going on in Housman's heart, he is, I think, thinking of Jackson, who left him not just specifically to marry a woman. When he got married, by the way, he fled to India, and when he came back to England briefly to get married, he didn't tell Housman, and he fled again. So the wedding, maybe a specifically bitter point for Housman. Again, not just because he's turning to one specific woman, but because he's turning to womankind, and not to Housman. So this reframing of the epithalamium as a poem of mourning from the perspective of the friends who lose the bridegroom is, I think, a really poignant one. And yet it's still filled with, I think, some rich and convincing marital imagery. Definitely a little bit of maybe backhandedness. Catch the starry beams they shed, prospering the marriage bed, and breed the land that reared your prime, sons to stay the rot of time. That's straight out of the first 15 sonnets of Shakespeare's that are all like, "Hey man, you're gonna get old, have a son." There's a little bit of that sentiment there. I'll just read it one more time and then sign off. This is Epithalamium by A.E. Housman, and in honor of my friend who just got married, though I don't feel bitterness about that. I'm very happy for him, and Laura seems truly, truly wonderful. This is Epithalamium by A.E. Housman. He is here, Urania's son, Hymen come from Helicon. God that glads the lover's heart, he is here to join and part. So the groomsman quits your side, and the bridegroom seeks the bride. Friend and comrade yield you o'er to her that hardly loves you more. Now the sun his skyward beam has tilted from the ocean stream. Light the Indies, laggard sun, happy bridegroom, day is done. And the star from Oeta's steep calls to bed, but not to sleep. Happy bridegroom, Hesper brings all desired and timely things. All whom morning sends to roam, Hesper loves to lead them home. Home return who him behold, child to mother, sheep to fold, bird to nest from wandering wide. Happy bridegroom, seek your bride. Pour it out, the golden cup, given and guarded, brimming up, safe through jostling markets borne, and the thicket of the thorn, folly spurned and danger past, pour it to the god at last. Now to smother noise and light is stolen abroad the wildering night, and the blotting shades confuse path and meadow full of dews, and the high heavens that all control turn in silence round the pole. Catch the starry beams they shed, prospering the marriage bed, and breed the land that reared your prime, sons to stay the rot of time. All is quiet, no alarms, nothing fear of nightly harms. Safe you sleep on guarded ground, and in silent circle round the thoughts of friends keep watch and ward, harnessed angels, hand on sword. Yeah, always got to be careful reading Housman because his voice is infectious. But congratulations to Elijah and Laura and the whole Blumoff clan. And David, you looked just the way I thought you would. I don't know. David's a fascinating guy. And Elijah's brother, Ahmed, is basically like a Tennessee Williams character. Totally a delight. And I thoroughly enjoyed meeting him. It was a lovely affair all told, and I felt unnervingly not cynical about it. So thanks again for the invitation. Shouldn't have gotten one. Should not have been at a wedding that small if I was not part of the family. But I was very honored to be. Lovely to see you all. I think I have a real life marriage couple pair of poems to talk about in the Secret Show that I'm. Yeah, you got a moral a little bit of a poetic moral quandary. We'll see how that goes. Write in with your AMA questions, and if you would like to have your poem critiqued in a listener crit episode, all you have to do is join the secret show. All right, thank you all for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.